In the description below this video, you'll find a link to the reference image, or you can visit ashleybainhurst.com and navigate to references for that same image. And welcome to Art Lessons Unlimited. By popular demand, we're going to make a painting of a nebula, outer space. The materials are limited, simple. You're going to need a black canvas, some paint, acrylic paint, oil paint, water-soluble oil paint. That's what I'm going to use. And the painting really doesn't take that long to do, although you will have to let it dry between two stages. First, we'll put in the stars, then we'll add the nebula. Beginning with a white canvas or canvas panel, tone the surface black. I'm using black acrylic paint and a foam brush. You can use any brush, but make sure you spread the paint out well, even if you can see through it a little bit. Once it's dry, I'm starting with a second coat that will ensure complete coverage. We want the coverage thin so that the weave of the canvas is still apparent and not tall brush strokes. I'm going to use white water-soluble oil paint and some water to thin it out. This is a bristle brush. It's meant for oil painting. If you're using acrylic paint, you can use a nylon brush, but this is a stiff brush. And I'll go ahead and start adding some water to the edge of my white paint to really thin it out. The intention here is to do some splatter painting, and I'll need a second tool. I'll use a brush handle for that. It's my advice that you experiment a little bit on a dark piece of paper or some other surface with how thin or thick your paint is once you've thinned it out. If you're using water-soluble oil paint like I am, then you're just going to use water to make it thin, a little bit runny. If you're using traditional oil paint, a standard medium, and you can use acrylic as well. Of course, you'll use water again to thin out your paint until it's kind of runny. The splatter painting helps us create a random variance of stars that feel like space, but don't be afraid to use a brush and paint in specific stars in areas that maybe received less splatter or just feel like you need a specific arrangement or constellation in an area if that's what you're after. I'm using this clear acrylic bridge just to steady my hand while I place a few final stars. To continue, we'll need a palette knife to mix colors and a few more bristle brushes. These are stiff brushes meant to be used with oil paint. Remember, I'm using water-soluble oil paint, so there are no fumes. I have titanium white, cerulean blue, cadmium red medium, and cadmium red deep. I'm going to start with the warm colors in my nebula. I already have a red and a yellow, so I'll mix a red-orange and a yellow-orange. By the way, we will use an eraser just to dig out a few small details in our nebula later in the process. And beginning with the red-orange, I'm just going to work, at least for starters, from left to right. Be careful that you don't have too much paint on your brush. You may need to blot it a little bit. The intention here is to manipulate how much paint is on our surface so that some of the blackness of the canvas, the blackness of space, peeps through our application. Since the nebula is a gaseous cloud, it needs to feel like gas or like smoke or vapor, and some of the stars behind the nebula poking through and the black canvas poking through the surface, it's what's going to make it feel like a gas cloud. Be sure to follow your reference, but you don't have to copy the reference exactly. Mostly paying attention right now to where the reds and oranges and yellow oranges fall, where it's lighter or darker, from red to yellow orange, or more or less solid. It's okay if your painted nebula doesn't exactly match your reference. I mean, these things are gas clouds. They change. I guess they change. I don't know if they change. But it's going to look like a nebula simply because of the characteristics. The thinness of the paint, the way the background shows through more in some places and less in others, large, vast areas of nondescript value with a few little sort of tight edges of pops of bright color mixed in. That's what a nebula is. That's what a nebula looks like anyway. And as long as we have those characteristics in our nebula, and maybe we don't show the reference to other people, it's going to look great. So if you're following along with my nebula, you'll just notice where the edges of our colored shapes are sharper and where they're softer. And where they are softer, you really want to scrub out your paint into the darkness, into the blackness of space, and lighten your pressure a little bit while you do so. That's going to give it a really soft edge. I like the idea of working with one sort of color family, one set of colors, and then switching to another. And this nebula is dominated by oranges, but also has some green and blue in there. So I'm going to work all around the areas where I see orange or yellow or red, those warmer colors, then switch to the cooler colors as a sort of a second step. A few small details. Before we get too far into our painting and you lose interest, now is a great time to remind you to subscribe to the channel. One way you can approach laying down these passages of color is to go ahead and put down sort of a strong stroke of color and then work either one edge or both edges of that stroke out into another color or out into space. And I'm doing that here. A strong stroke worked out on its top edge into some color that's already on our canvas. Okay, this ring of orange in the lower right is almost complete. And we're going to go ahead and start creating a second color now, or a second color family that'll be greens and blues. So just mixing some of the cerulean blue with the cadmium yellow will make a type of a green. It's not very strong. It's not quite as green actually as what we can see in the reference, but that's okay. No one's going to see the reference but you and I. This area of gas is appropriate in color because the blue is in the center, and if we were to mix, if we did actually mix yellow and blue together, this is the color that we would get, and that's how it's happening in the nebula as well. This greener color is a combination of those two different colored gases. Don't be afraid to use your fingers. It's not exactly finger painting, but you could finger paint if you want to. All right, I'm actually doing a little bit of color mixing and painting with my finger, but switching back to the brush, we'll move to the gaseous ring in the top left. And I'm going to go ahead and follow the same process and lay in some of those greens, grayish greens, and then begin to add some of the blue paint, the really brighter pops of blue that we can see happening in two different areas. We'll lay in all the blue areas in the top left ring of color first, and then bounce back down to the ring in the bottom right. Now, one thing that's going to really make your painting convincing is having some really sharp little details, some sharp little delineations of colored edges along our gaseous clouds. Don't leave those out. I love this combination of colors. Orange and blue are complementary colors, so they really bring out the intensity of one another when they're close together. Like we've done before, we want to lay down maybe a strong stroke of color and then wipe our brush out and work the edge of that color so that it fades into an adjacent color or again out into space. And so I'm trying to really fade this blue, this strong stroke of blue, into some of that weaker green that's around it. Again, with the finger smearing and the finger smudging, a non-traditional tool. And another non-traditional tool is the eraser. If your paint's thin enough, you can make small marks through it with your eraser that gives your painting a feeling of specificity and detail that you can't get with a brush. Lastly, look for any areas that need a second coating or a topping of color, just so that the intensity is as variable as it can be. Strong colors up against weaker colors. That's another characteristic of these nebula. And a few more stars over the top, and this nebula is complete. That is the end of the lesson. Now, go forth and explore strange new worlds of your own creation.